I am Susan Meehan, and I'm talking today with Charles Stone, an attorney by profession and a lifelong resident of Cumberland County. And we are in the recording studio of the Cumberland County Historical Society. Mr. Stone has been an active member of the Historical Society for some years and has served on the board of directors as well as several committees, and he is presently a member of the Publications Committee. Now, I have read the very interesting family history that Mr. Stone has given to the Society's library, but would like to cover some of the basic facts for viewers who have not had the opportunity to read it. So, how is it that you came to Cumberland County?
Well, my parents brought me here when I was not quite 2 years old. Actually, I was born in Dauphin County. My parents were then living at 110 Locust Street, next door to my grandmother, a widow, at 108 Locust Street. My parents were married in 1926, and I appeared in February 28, 1928, apparently in the Harrisburg Hospital, hours away from the leap year accident of February 29th, because I was actually born on February 28th. And otherwise I would be only 22 years old or so by this time. So in 1929, my father built the house in which I now live at the end of 3rd Street in New Cumberland, which was then sort of on the edge of the country, because it was near his mother and near his business, which was, in those days, the manufacture of paper boxes and cigar boxes. And so we moved in, and I have lived in various places since, in college, in the Army, in law school, and in Harrisburg and in Lemoyne and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but somehow I'm back into Cumberland, where I have been for a long, long time.
I think you are the one of the holders of a lot of knowledge about New Cumberland and that area of the West Shore, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have your memories put on record. For starts, how about the local schools that you attended?
Well, there was no public kindergarten in those days. We're still arguing about that. But there was no pre-K school. But I was sent to Mrs. Bird's kindergarten. I think she spelled it B-Y-R-D, but I'm not really sure about that. Mrs. Bird's kindergarten was located on the square in New Cumberland, in Market Square. Whatever happened to Mrs. Bird, I have no idea. And I was sent to kindergarten, and my memory of that is indistinct, except I think I recall being named conductor of the rhythm band. There are friends of mine, a couple still remaining, who will tell stories about my behavior in those days. They are, of course, denied. After that, I went to public school in New Cumberland. The public school, the elementary school in those days was at 5th and Bridge. It is now the office of Dr. Clem Ciccarelli. And in those days, it was the 5th Street School. Now everybody refers to it as the Green Hill School, but I never heard that when I was younger. There were 6 grades there. I went to all 6, although I skipped from 2nd to 3rd in the middle of the 2nd grade because apparently I was driving my 2nd grade teacher crazy, and she told the school superintendent she had to get rid of this kid. So I was put in the middle of 3rd grade in the middle of the winter, I think, of 1935 perhaps. So I went to that school, and from there I went to the New Cumberland Junior High School, which is now an apartment house. That was at 7th and Reno Streets. It was not originally a part of the borough of New Cumberland. That was called Elkwood. It was annexed into New Cumberland early in the 20th century, and apparently it also at some time served as an elementary school for people who lived in that part of what later became the borough. I just found that out a few years ago, actually. It was 2 years there at what we called the Elkwood School. That was 7th and 8th grades. After that, I went to New Cumberland High School. Although I think my parents had a debate because my mother thought I should be sent to a boarding school. She had been a boarding school girl, and she thought I should go to Lawrenceville or Mercersburg. My father didn't think that was a good idea, so I didn't do that. I went to the New Cumberland High School, which was then at the end of 8th Street in New Cumberland, proudly constructed by the Borough Fathers. I think about 1928, the architect was Ed Green, who also later on did Cedar Cliff High School, the Dauphin County Courthouse, the Cumberland County Courthouse, and many other buildings around here. I went there 4 years to New Cumberland High School, and then I was finished and ready to go to college. Shall I go on with
Well,
my education?
now let me,
Let's back up.
How many, it wasn't a one-room school in the elementary?
No,
You had
no.
more than one teacher.
No, I did not go to a one-room school. The kids in Newmarket across the creek, or as we say locally, crick, they were in Fairview Township in York County. They went to a one-room school, and they're very proud of it. And I have still some friends who think that was not a bad idea. You advanced according to your ability, and if you got through the readers sooner, you didn't have to stay 8 years. But we did away with all that. Anyway, in my school was a grade by grade, a teacher for each grade. My first grade teacher was a Miss Shope, spelled S-H-O-P-E. Whatever happened to Miss Shope, I have no idea. My second grade teacher was a Miss Jacoby, J-A-C-O-B-Y. She came from, I believe, Newville, and her father was something like the county superintendent of schools. She and Brant Cook, the great West Shore athlete, later married. Miss Jacoby, I think, was the one who couldn't stand having me around anymore. So in the middle of the second grade, I was put in the middle of third grade where a Miss Waggle, Mahala, how do you spell Mahala? I'm not sure. M-A-H-A-L-A perhaps, Waggle, W-E-I-G-E-L. Miss Waggle became my teacher. There was some kind of a substitute or apprentice teacher with her. I kind of remember this. That was third grade. Fourth grade was Mrs. Watkins. Fifth grade, we started to circulate through the school for different classes. So we had Miss Patty. It might have been Eleanor, I'm not sure, P-A-T-T-Y. As one of my teachers, Miss Coover. That's another teacher. Sixth grade, we had those teachers, and we had as our homeroom teacher, Mrs. Reed. I don't remember her first name. Of course, we didn't hear first names in those days. Mrs. Reed was not only the sixth grade homeroom teacher, she was the principal of the elementary school, for which she probably got an extra $200 a year. She had her own little office, which is about as big as the recording studio we're in right now, and she had a belief in traditional discipline. If you misbehaved, corporal punishment as directed in the book of Proverbs, spare the rod and spoil the child. She believed in that. So she whacked the kids. She also shouted orders and imprecations from the second story of the school during recess. If the children at recess were getting out of hand with their behavior, she threatened physical and other retribution, which was freely administered. Yes, the athletic program at the elementary school, I must tell you about that. The school board was most generous. They had acquired a beanbag for the boys and jumping ropes for the girls. A short one for the little girls to go in their solitary pursuit of that sport, and the big long rope, which the girls would grab either end of the very long rope and swing it and make a big simple harmonic motion, I guess it was, so that the other girls would hop on and off or in between the ropes or whatever you did. That was the only athletic program there was. There was no other athletic program in the elementary school. Of course, you were directed never to think about leaving the schoolyard, which was about like an ordinary front yard of a house. That's about all the larger it was. It was paved. So if you fell down, you scuffed yourself up. Too bad. Uh, you were not allowed at recess to cross the alley to go to Mr. DiRoberta's to buy the piece of candy for the penny. No, you were not allowed to do that. You did that after school. Okay. So that was elementary school. By today's standards, I suppose it would be considered primitive, but somehow we all learned to read and write and figure a little.
They must have done something for your memory. I'm impressed that you can remember the teachers' names.
Pretty much, there were other teachers there. I might have missed one or two, but I think I have them pretty much located. Well, also in that time, there was a Miss Bone, Sarah Bone, whose sister worked for us in our box factory. There was also there was another Miss Patty. There were two Miss Patties. And I don't remember first names. I think the one might have been Eleanor. The other one was sort of tall and skinny, and the other was short and not so skinny. That was, yes, that was the faculty.
How about school activities? Were there scout programs or music programs, anything like that you...
Well, at the elementary school level, the activities were, yes, there was a music teacher. Actually, there was a Miss Wolf and a Mrs. Miller. In my memory, they're all confused and melded into one woman. She came and she tried to teach us some basic music appreciation. Maybe I learned the scale, the names of the lines and spaces, a little bit of basic singing, and then, but then in those days we had on the radio Walter Damrosch, Damrosch. Walter Damrosch came on in those days AM because there was no FM then, and there was a program scheduled to come on during the school hours, and that's when you had music class, and Walter Damrosch would tell you about people like Mozart and Beethoven and other classical composers, and then he would play a part of maybe the Jupiter Symphony, maybe Beethoven's Fifth, I don't remember, and he would talk about it then.
Like Carl Haas, sort of.
Like Carl Haas, two generations later. Yeah. This is Walter Damrosch in 1936 and 1938 doing this for school children before Lenny Bernstein. Now, is there anything like that today? I have no idea. I hope there is, but I don't think there is. So anyway, that's, now, as some people know, I play a little piano around town and I have a pretty good ear, but in those days the music didn't come out. I couldn't sing. I still can't sing. I don't sing a note. I hold the hymn book, but nothing comes out. So it didn't take it first. Anyway, the other arts. There was an art teacher. She was Miss Carl, Martha Carl, spelled C-A-R-L. She later married Shal Radcliffe of the downtown men's clothing store of Radcliffe and Schwartz. And Martha Carl, those of us, even though we were not yet in puberty, noticed that she was a very attractive young woman. We actually noticed this, and it was discussed. But this is what I remember about Miss Carl. She was at the cutting edge. She brought in reproductions of Picasso and Salvador Dali and told us this is what's going on in the world of art. You should know about this stuff. Now, this I think this is extraordinary. This would happen a little over Cumberland in 1938 or whatever it was. I just think that's extraordinary. She did that because I remember it. She also, unfortunately, I did not have my great aunt's artistic ability. She was a very gifted painter, but I could not ever get beyond stick figures. but Miss Carl did her best. She had us do our masterpiece. I remember this in art class. This is about the 5th grade or something. And I seem to remember it was a Hobbema, Hobbema, the Dutch landscape painter, 17th century, who did the great big trees towering over the little Dutch cottage that somebody was trying to live in. And we were supposed to copy this picture in watercolors. And of course, for me, this was a total disaster, absolute catastrophe. But she did her best, though. So what I think is interesting, that, we had no high school really until the 20s in New Cumberland. There was kind of a high school, but it was in the 5th Street School, and only 3 or 4 people went through a year. And all of a sudden, some people in New Cumberland got together and decided we have to have some kind of public education. They got this done somehow. So here we are. We kept on chugging along, yes. Other organized activities, there was Boy Scouting was very popular in New Cumberland. There were several active troops. Nothing was said about that in the school system, though. I think at the elementary school level, I don't remember any other organized activities. And it comes later in high school, of course.
Well, at the time that you were going through the schools, when did New Cumberland start to really grow? Was that after World War II?
Well, New Cumberland, of course, again, it begins, we think, with Peter Chartier, who had an Indian mother and a French father, and had a trading post in maybe the 1740s in what is now not by the creek, but around 15th Street in New Cumberland by the river, probably because it was higher there and wouldn't flood. There's no real record of organized New Cumberland until Mr. Haldeman laid out his town, and after he bought the Chartier land and other land and put together the town that was sometimes known as Haldeman Town and later as Cumberland and finally New Cumberland. It was still a small town with a few hundred people until well after 1900. When I was growing up, it was probably, and the census figures are the best evidence, maybe 3,000 or so. After the war, that's capital W for World War II, of course, after the war, there was this great growth of New Cumberland resulting from the GI Bill, which made mortgage financing easier for veterans, and the growth of the population. So New Cumberland attained its present size in the 50s and the 60s, and then basically we filled up the geographical borders because there's nowhere else to go because we're surrounded by other boroughs, and there is no way to make it any bigger geographically. So yes, so of course,
you weren't really beneficiary of some of the more modernization things until when you were going through school.
When I was going through school,
Except the new high school.
the high school was new in 1928, I think. I found some material which I gave to the society celebrating the opening of the school, the dedication. The borough fathers, there weren't borough mothers in those days because they weren't in politics. They were starting to get into it. All the school board, of course, were old guys. All the old guys were worried. They had borrowed something like $200,000 to build this schoolhouse, and they were worried how would they ever pay this back. But they did. Anyway. So yes, the New Cumberland High School remained a New Cumberland High School until, of course, the New Cumberland School Board voted, and this is still a matter of some dispute whether it was a good idea to join with Lemoyne High School and other school districts to form what became the West Shore School District, at which point New Cumberland High School disappeared. That's about 1958. That's a decade and a half after I left it. Yes. When I was in shall we go on to my junior high school? Or
Sure.
All right. Junior high school, 7th grade, you go to what we call the Elkwood School or the junior high school. Again, it's at 7th Street and Reno. It contained just the two grades, 7th and 8th grades. The teachers there were Mrs. Kirkpatrick, Mary Kirkpatrick, who was just wonderful because she made us parse and analyze sentences, and there were certain sins that are unpardonable. The comma splice, you just can't do that. You either have a semicolon or you have a period and start over, but you can't join two independent clauses with a comma. Now, do people these days care? She cared, and she was just wonderful, and she was a tough lady. We love the tough ones. She was. Roy Sutton, he doubled because he also taught at the high school, but in the 7th grade he was a homeroom teacher, and he taught something like, I know we had to draw a blast furnace. You had to know how a blast furnace worked, and where you put in the coal and where you put in the iron ore and where you lit the fire, whatever it is, and you had to draw this thing and have it approved by Mr. Sutton. He was pretty good about things like that. In high school, he taught biology. Let's see, the other school teachers in the 7th, in the junior high school, Mary Kirkpatrick, Roy Sutton, Mr. Straley. What was Mr. Straley's first name? Don't remember. Straley, I think. Mr. Straley taught history. Blaine Seitz, Seitz, who was my father's second cousin. And he taught math. And that was it. That was the whole faculty. Was there a principal? I don't know who it was. Probably Mary Kirkpatrick. She would have been good for that. I think there were 4 rooms and 4 teachers. Now the athletic program now was expanded. The school district had acquired a volleyball and a softball or 2 and a couple of bats. So at recess or at PT, there was PT. We called it phys ed. And Mr. Seitz, who was the math teacher but also doubled as the physical education teacher, would take us out and try to teach us how to spike a volleyball. Then, in spring we would advance to softball. Now there was nowhere to go except a vacant lot, which was around the corner on facing Brant Avenue a block away. Somehow the school district had acquired the right to use the vacant lot for kids to play softball during their assigned hour. The problem was the outfielder was lower than the rest of the field because somebody had started to excavate the lot. So the outfielders were looking up at the plate. That's the way things were. That was the entire, I don't remember, and there might have been some primitive track effort. Tennis didn't exist. There was a tennis court, but it was just repaired. It was never used. There was some effort at basketball. There was no organized midget football or junior football. None of that until high school. So that was it. That was the athletic program. The arts program continued. It was Miss Carl, but this time she may have been Mrs. Radcliffe. I'm not sure. And there was a Miss Wolf / Mrs. Miller. As I say, the two have merged in my memory. I cannot remember them apart at all. There was a music teacher. Her name was Miller / Wolf. So that was junior high school. Junior high school, we advanced. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, bless her heart, she was good. She made you take the language seriously.
Then how large would your class have been?
Typically, by today's standards, they were too big. We would have, I think, maybe 25 to 30 in a class, and this is also true of the elementary school experience and the junior high experience, and even into high school. I recently looked at some studies and indicate that small class size, it really doesn't make that much difference. Anyway, we had bigger classes. So
now, how many were in your graduating class in high school? 200? Or?
No, around 106. That's hard to count Some people disappeared and joined the Navy because of war. We had a war going on, and some people just disappeared. A couple of kids, they joined the Navy, they joined the Army, and they were gone from the scene. Most people did not quit, but we'll get to that question. Most people did not quit school. The dropout rate was very small, but a few did. Yes. So, shall I go into high school?
Sure.
Okay. Now, again, I remember my parents debating. Charles should go to Lawrenceville. Charles should go to Mercersburg. Proper young men from Harrisburg went to boarding schools. Pop, my father, just didn't think that was a good idea, so I didn't. Now, when I got to Princeton, of course, I was woefully underprepared for the experience, but we'll get to that later. So I went to the New Cumberland High School. In the middle of, okay, but the New Cumberland High School at that time was 9, 10, 11, 12, 4 grades. I guess we're back to that. That's what I hear. We come and go on that question. We're back to 4 grades in high school. The school then was sort of new because it was only a little over 10 years old in 1941. And, of course, what everybody remembers, of course, of a certain age is in the middle of my 9th grade experience, Pearl Harbor happened. And what I remember is Mr. Gemmell, Gemmil, the superintendent of schools, called us, everybody, into a big assembly and said, this is bad news. We're having this war. It might go on for years. And I can remember him saying, some people say it might last 15 years. We thought that was not a good idea. We don't know where we're going with this, but we had to prepare for difficult times and different times. So my high school experience begins with America stumbling into war, being brought into war, and it ends in my high school graduation. Germany had surrendered, Hitler and Roosevelt were gone, the Japanese were still fighting, and we didn't know about the bomb, so we thought that might go on and on and on. And most of us who were boys and 17 years old expected to go to war. And so my whole senior high school experience is surrounded by war. Nothing was normal.
Could you tell us how it was that you heard about war being declared?
Everybody remembers this.
Yes.
You know where you were when
Right.
Kennedy was shot. You know where you were when Roosevelt died. I was in the backyard and somebody went by and told me. And Pearl Harbor, I was doing what I thought all 13-year-olds did on Sunday afternoon. We were listening to the New York Philharmonic and the symphony because that's what people did. On Saturday, we listened to the opera with Milton Cross, broadcasting live on the Texaco Opera Network. And on Sunday, we listened to the New York Philharmonic. And I think John Barbaroli was the conductor in those days. And don't ask me what they were playing, but then the program was interrupted to tell us that something terrible had happened in Pearl Harbor. And then they went on with the concert, of course, because there was no cable news. There were only cables in those days. There was no telephone service across the Pacific. So you waited and waited, of course, until we hear more about it. But yes, I was home listening to the symphony. So, of course, that changed everything. Rationing came, gas rationing came. Now, my father, because we had a box factory, he had a different kind of a coupon. He got more gas because he had a business to run. But we had ration coupons, of course, all during the war for various kinds of food. I found some in my famous attic, and I gave them to the society several years ago. They're here somewhere in some collection. Yes. So the whole high school experience is underlined with war. Like to go to places, you had to find somebody who had a car with enough gas to get you there. Now, we had public transportation. You could get to Harrisburg on the bus.
Did you have organized scrap drives through the school and that sort of thing?
Well, the Boy Scout troop. We went around town in our express wagons, collecting fat from willing housewives, and that was somehow recycled into things that blow up somehow. I don't understand how. Yes, we didn't recycle newspapers in those days. I think that hadn't been invented yet. But
You didn't have to take metal or bottles or those things that you're aware of.
I think
Maybe your mother did that.
I don't remember recycling metal or glass or paper. Nothing like that was organized until many, many decades later. I don't remember that. I remember collecting fat for some reason.
As you were, of course, it was atypical with the war's influence, but how did you get was there public transportation that would take you to Harrisburg?
Well, yes. Again, first transportation to school. I should put this in as long as we're on transportation. I walked to school. All elementary school, junior high, and high school were all within a mile, and I walked. And I walked home. Now, everybody did that in elementary school because all the kids who were going to that elementary school were within walking distance. They were from the town. That's where they lived. What I've learned in recent years is how difficult it was for the country kids, as we call them, to get to high school because there was no school bus. That hadn't been invented yet, at least in Pennsylvania. Elizabeth, my wife, talks about taking the school bus to school in Eatonton, Georgia, but we didn't have anything like that. So if you wanted to get to high school, and stay in high school, you had to figure out what to do. You hitchhiked, your father drove you in his old Model T, you rode your bicycle, or some took the train. The train came through Goldsboro and Cly and York Haven up along the river then to New Cumberland. And the kids would take the train. The train would stop to take kids. The conductor would wait till the last kid got on the train and start the train again. That's how they got to school. Amazing. Yes. Now, we had public transport.
But there were some from York County came into New Cumberland for school.
Yes. The New Cumberland School District included, I think, all of Fairview Township and part of Newberry. So that's a lot of square miles. There was no other school to go to there. The nearest other high school would have been in Dillsburg, which that later became what we called the Northern District. And I don't know where the high school was on the way to York. I don't know of a high school before you get to York, even today. I mean, we have Redland, but Redland was created by the West Shore School District. There was no such thing before that district. So, yes, that's the way it was to get to school. How did you get around town if you didn't have enough gas coupons to put gas in the car? We had public transportation. The trolley car came to New Cumberland early in the 20th century. Trolley cars, as you know, were everywhere. The trolley car disappeared, the tracks disappeared somewhere in the mid-1930s. I vaguely remember traveling on the trolley car with my mother. There were wicker seats. You got stuck in the wicker, and then the trolley cars disappeared and buses came. And yes, you could go to Harrisburg on the bus. You can still go to Harrisburg on the bus if you can figure out when it goes and comes. Yes. Of course, the most popular person in any high school group in those days, of course, was the one who had the wheels. I remember a couple of kids somehow they had use of their father's car to go around, and they were very popular and very much admired because they could do that. But there was a great limit to what you could do because gas, well, it wasn't expensive, but you couldn't get it. Yes.
So as you were growing up, for shopping, like for your clothing or your parents' clothing, was that Harrisburg orientation?
My mother, of course, was a Harrisburg girl. She had been grown up in Harrisburg. Her friends were all in Harrisburg. She never got over being a Harrisburg girl. Her idea of buying anything or doing anything was to go to Harrisburg. Unfortunately, she never drove. So my father took her lots of places, but she rode the bus. The bus did okay. Yes. So, of course, in those days, there was a downtown. There were the department stores. There were the ladies' specialty shops and the men's shops. That's where you went to buy things. We had stores in New Cumberland. We had Doc Rife's, a men's store. We had Esther Hemp, the ladies' clothing store. They survived, and Esther Hemp's store survived until just maybe 2 years ago when it finally gave up.
And how about that movie theater that's so popular
The movie
now?
theater, well, of course, it's not the first movie theater in New Cumberland. There was I have been told there was a movie theater on the corner. It would be the northwestern corner of the market, where there had been a livery stable, and then it was a movie theater that I do not remember that showed movies very early in the 20th century when movies first started. The movie theater I remember is on Market Street, where there's recently been a restaurant called Puliti's, P-U-L-I-T-I, which is now gone. That was a movie theater until it became a bowling alley, and then later a bar, and then a restaurant, and then another restaurant, etc. The present movie theater on Bridge Street, the so-called West Shore Theater, I think was built in 1940 in wonderful Art Deco, Art Moderne style by a family called the Freistocks, F-R-E-I-S-T-A-K, who are Slovaks, who somehow wound up in New Cumberland, PA, early in the 20th century. There are still Freistocks around town, and one of them I saw just the other day. But the Freistocks sold the movie to Fred Bolin, B-O-L-L-E-N, who was my neighbor, who was a teacher at the West Shore School District. He taught business there. And Fred Bolin is gone, but his son, another Fred Bolin, is now running the theater and now has expressed an interest in selling it. We hope the theater, of course, continues. It's, of course, a neighborhood theater. It's one of the few of its kind left around here, and we can only hope for the best. Before that theater was built, there were houses there. I do not remember what they were like. Yes.
Well, now, how about the flood of 1936?
Okay.
You must remember that.
Well, I remember I was 8.
Or parts of it.
I had turned 8, and yes, there was a flood. Now, my father's box factory, which I have written about in the memoir I have given to the society, in 1936, his business was located, manufacturing was located entirely at 119 Bridge Street, which now, I'm sorry to say, is a pizza parlor and a beer distributor. But he and his brother Jerry had acquired what later became our cigar box factory along the river from the Bachman, that's B-A-U-G-H-M-A-N, the Bachman estate, the same Bachman the church is named for in New Cumberland. But they hadn't moved anything in there in 1936. Mr. Bachman built his factory in 1902, I think, just above the level of the 1902 flood. 1902 or 1903, there was a large flood in that year, and Mr. Bachman was assured that the water could never go any higher. He was wrong about that. In 1936, my father said that he called the weather bureau. He knew the weatherman because in those days everybody knew everybody, and that's another part of our story. He called the weatherman and said, and the weatherman said, Charlie, don't worry, this is not going to amount to much. So he didn't take the necessary protective action and stacked things on top of tables instead of trying to evacuate. And so the business was entirely inundated by a flood. It was totally underwater. Everything he owned was underwater. He was back in business in 7 days. Everybody worked hard. They scrubbed away and hosed away, and they were back in business making boxes in a week. Amazing. 1936. It didn't go so well in 1972, but that's another part of the story. So, yes. What I remember is that this was, of course, a major event. Of course, I'm sure there had always been floods, but then Europeans came and built their towns and cities along waterways. You do that because that's how you can get around before you have proper roads and automobiles and airplanes. And so all the older towns are built along waterways, and when the waterways flood, the towns get flooded. New Cumberland got flooded badly, and it was a major event. I remember being in a rowboat, being paddled around to look down at our property, which was underneath the water. I remember being issued wading boots so I could wade in the water. Yes.
Well, were schools closed for a few days? Do you remember?
Schools were not underwater. I think the schools were not
Well, I
closed.
thought maybe the kids couldn't go. Couldn't get there.
Most people
Took a boat to school.
Again, you were within walking distance of your school. There were no buses. There was no transportation. You walked to school. Yes.
So would you say the flood was one of the bigger town events in your childhood? You know,
It's
you're
a pretty
under
big,
18.
yeah, again, yes, that's a pretty big event.
Mm-hmm.
There were other floods. There was a 41 flood. It was a big threat, but it wasn't as bad. There was some damage done. Of course, the biggest flood was 72, which was really devastating.
Well, if you want to go ahead and insert that here, you can go ahead.
Well, the
You're thinking
72
that.
flood we called Agnes, of course, and it was a June flood. Now, we are used to spring floods. You have a spring flood when the ice melts and the snow melts and the rivers are flooded with the melt. But Agnes was in the June, and it was a tropical storm that got stuck. It wouldn't go away. And that's a very unusual kind of a flood to have. But we had it in 72. That was very damaging, and that was very devastating to our box business, which was still functioning then, and damaged it, from which it never really quite recovered. But so why do we build our towns, and why do we not give up and move away, but people still keep rebuilding?
Well, maybe you could tell us something about the box business, about the type of boxes that you built and who you made them
Well,
for.
again, I will briefly recount what I've written something about, is that my father, of course, I have to tell you about my father. My grandfather, Hiram David Stone, was born in 1865, and he met my grandmother apparently at a Sunday school picnic or a Granger's picnic. I don't have that quite straight. The story was that she had fallen somehow, and he picked her up, and that's how they met. So my father would say he picked her out of the ditch, and then she would bristle at that way of putting it. So there were two sons, my father Charles and my uncle Jerry, 5 years younger, born in 1893 and 1898. They were raised in a Huck Finn kind of world. They were farm boys. There was a common school. You went through the 6 readers. When you were finished with the 6 readers, you were finished with your education. There was no thought of high school. It just hadn't occurred to anybody that you might want to do any more than that. Because everybody had always been a farmer, and you assumed you'd have to be a farmer too. But then my grandfather was dragged by mules in 1907. He died from the infection 3 days later. And my father and uncle were orphaned at ages of 14 and 9. My grandmother was somehow had enough money to get out of the farming business. They were tenant farmers. He didn't own a farm. and moved into New Cumberland on a little house that she built with the money she had. He had saved some money somehow. I don't know how he saved any money, but he did, my grandfather. So my father went to work at 14. He went to work in the woolen mill, Mr. Bachman's woolen mill, 50 cents a day. And then the news came you could make big money if you took the ferry boat to Steelton and worked at the Elliott Fisher plant. You could make 90 cents a day. You had to pay for the ferry ride at 5 cents. So to make 90 cents a day, it was worth it. You had to get up at God knows what time in the morning to do this. And it was awful. So my father he's about 19 when he goes to my grandmother and says, I can't do this. I want to do something else now. So he gets himself to business school. He enrolls in the Harrisburg. I found a diploma, something like the Harrisburg School of Business, and he learns a little bit about bookkeeping and basic transactions and I don't know what. And gets a job by 1912. He's 19. He gets a job in the Harrisburg Trust Company, introduced to Mr. Riley by Mr. Minter, Park Minter, who was already working in the bank. They knew each other as children. So father is now a 19-year-old banker. So no more blue collar world. So, but he works in the bank, and that's going pretty well. War comes, and he's hearing about 1917 comes. He's 24. He hears about this business about being drafted and going to France and the trenches and all that. No, that's not a good idea. He joins the Navy. He takes his trombone because he'd been playing his trombone to supplement his income. He was a pretty good musician, you see. So he goes to Chicago. He joins the Navy, Charles G. Stone, musician, and becomes a bandmaster in the Navy, and his boss is John Philip Sousa. So that's a great story. And I think he has a great time in the Navy. He fought the Kaiser by taking his band around the Midwest, playing in Liberty Bond rallies, selling government bonds. And I have a letter, which I want to give to the Society of Appreciation about the great job he had done taking his band all over the place. So he comes back to Harrisburg, and two things happen. He meets my mother because she had gone to work. 1917, she was already 28, but she had been, of course, to the St. Mary's Hall boarding school, an Episcopal boarding school, had been trained to be a young lady, and apparently her only role at that time was to take care of her widowed mother and her single sister, and rejects her suitors, which she did regularly, apparently. Everybody was in love with my mother because she was good looking. But she met my father, and they took a fancy to each other. And of course, this was not a match that was approved. There was a difference in background. It goes on. But when the second thing happened after he met my mother, he went back to see Mr. Wiley and said, I'm back from the war. And Mr. Wiley said something like, oh, Mr. Stone, we're so glad to have you back after you served your country. And, of course, you can have your job back, but by the way, we'll have to cut your wages. So he had started out at $30 a month. What it was by 1917, I'm not sure. So this was I misused the word epiphany. This is another epiphany. I can't do this anymore. I can't work for other people. So meanwhile, somebody had started a paper box factory in New Cumberland. They had one employee. They had gone broke and run away. The employee was sitting there hoping somebody would pay her. My father heard about this. He took it over somehow. He had $600 he had saved playing his horn, and that was his investment. So we made paper boxes. Think of shirt boxes, necktie boxes, pocket handkerchief boxes, ladies' hosiery boxes, candy boxes. That's what we made.
With a nice paper wrapping.
Exactly. Now, not the kind you fold up flat.
Right.
The kind that come already in 3 dimensions. That's what we made. In Carlisle, there was a company called Carlisle Box Company run by the Tay family. They did the same thing we did. There were 2 other box factories in Harrisburg in those days, the Harrisburg Paper Box Company and the Penn Harris Box Company. They didn't survive much after the 30s. Father's business, he took his brother in, and they did well. They prospered. And they prospered in the 20s and the 30s. When everybody else was going broke in the 30s, somehow we continued to grow. He got into the cigar box business by taking over a little shop that had gone out of business in New Cumberland. And we became a significant producer of cigar boxes in the United States, in New Cumberland. And again, this is all in other memoirs I've written, but we were making about 10 million boxes a year in those days, in the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s. So,
Did you ever spend any time in the production learning?
well,
that,
that's another part of the story, of course. Being the only son and the only hope of dynasty, my father had visions that I would somehow become a great industrialist. But when I got out of Princeton, I did spend my first year or 2 in that business. It did not go that well, and it's difficult to be the boss's son. It was not an easy thing. But another war came along, the Korean War, and I got drafted in 1950 and went off. And after that 2-year experience, I had decided to go to law school. But I had to, of course, by necessity, had to stay with this business, and we continued to function until 1986, when we were able to sell a somewhat reduced and greatly diminished enterprise.
How long did your father live? What year did
He lived until 1978, yes.
So he was present for Agnes then?
Yes,
That was-
yes. That was too bad, but
Yeah.
yes, and of course, what happened to the box business is basically our customers disappeared. I found a customer list recently, about 60 years old, and there were 50-odd customers named on there. Only one still exists. That's IBM. Anyway. Yes,
And
at one
did
point,
plastic bag have an impact?
plastic bags had an impact. Folding cartons had an impact. We made many hundreds of millions of women's 1/4 dozen hosiery boxes. Ladies' hosiery came 3 pairs to a box. You bought a 1/4 dozen in a box we made. It was about 5/8 of an inch deep, I think is the dimension, about so big, and that, of course, has all disappeared. Now, all that packaging, that whole style of packaging has virtually disappeared. Yes, what we used to make is almost made entirely now in China. Yeah, and of course the classic cigar box is the kind we made for basically the cheaper cigars. Has virtually disappeared, I think. So
Didn't you? I believe I read that the business began by making wooden cigar boxes.
yes.
didn't it?
And our father, he did not make a better mousetrap. He made a cheaper mousetrap. And in 1931, he came out with a different way of putting a cigar box together, which he was able to sell more cheaply, and that outraged his competitors, and that led to a very complicated lawsuit, which went on for 7 years. So we spent the 30s in litigation.
Is that what got you interested in the law?
I don't think so. I always thought I might go to law school, and then in the Army, my best friends were all either lawyers or about to be lawyers, and it just seemed like that was the natural thing for me to do.
Now, are you what I term a office lawyer or a court lawyer?
I'm what the Brits would call a solicitor. I'm an office lawyer. I push papers around. I have been basically transactional matters, real estate transactions, and estates, and estate administration, and trust administration, and some estate planning, and business transactions of various kinds. We have had clients who have been real estate developers and builders and real estate speculators. Yeah, that's been the principal focus of my practice, and that's the practice that my son David continues today. Our daughter is a lawyer, but she's a litigator. She's not like us. I don't know where she gets that from. And she's on her own, yes.
Now, when you practice law, is this Cumberland County and Dauphin County, or do you have to have dual licensing?
Well, no, that's a whole story of its own. It used to be, of course, in Pennsylvania, we were a holdout. You belonged to a county bar. And so if you belonged to a county bar, you weren't welcome in the county next door unless you had somebody with you from that county. Now, I was originally enrolled as a Dauphin County lawyer, but then I became a Cumberland County lawyer when I went into practice with Russell Updegraff and Clinton R. Widener, who later became Judge Widener, on our bench here. And so when I started to practice, if I went to Dauphin County, I had to have a Dauphin County lawyer with me, or at least introduce me. Judge Shugart, who was president judge of our courts in Cumberland County for many years until 1983, had a more severe view. If a Dauphin County lawyer came to Cumberland County to do the simplest matter in a courtroom, he had to have a Cumberland County lawyer with him, introduce him, and stay for the entire proceeding. That really discouraged crossing the county lines. We have largely done away with that. We have, in theory at least, statewide practice. In real life, it doesn't work quite that way. There are lots of places where if you're going into strange territory, you ought to have somebody local to at least talk to. Statewide practice isn't really statewide. Different counties do things in different ways. The only way you find this out is by finding it out. There's really no book that explains all this.
Now, we've reached about an hour. Can we continue? Do you want to continue?
I'm fine. I'm
okay.
Fine.
Good. We will.
Okay.
So, did you go to Dickinson Law School?
I did not.
Oh,
what happened was when I was in the Army, I made the decision I would go to law school. Also, I was, of course, at that time, quite heavily involved with my intended Elizabeth, and we got married when I was still in the Army. I was never overseas in the Army, but I was in interesting places like Fort Slocum and Fort Knox and Indiantown Gap. And we got married in February of 1952, and then I got out of the Army in December of 1952, and I started to apply to law schools, and I was accepted to several of them. Life was simpler in those days, and I decided I would go to Harvard. So Elizabeth and I went to Cambridge, found an apartment, and we lived 3 years in Cambridge while I went to the Harvard Law School, yes, which was a great experience. Did I need to go to the Harvard Law School to practice law around here? No, I didn't, but it was still a great experience, and I'm glad I did it.
Made up for the lack of private school earlier.
Yes. Again, my mother was right, but so was my father. They were both right. I would have been much better prepared for Princeton, which was a bit of a shock to me. My problem in high school was that it was too easy for me, and then I didn't develop the proper habits and disciplines, and but I survived all this somehow.
Well, now let's leave some of the personal influence or emphasis and move to a little bit about the county and your views on the county. When you practice, your practice, you say, is somewhat in Dauphin County and Harrisburg.
Again,
What I'm trying to say is New Cumberland oriented more toward Harrisburg than it is toward Carlisle, toward the county seat.
Well, it depends on how do you frame the question. The kind of practice we have traditionally done, which is a lot of real estate, because we were my office is 400 yards from York County. The creek is the dividing line. It's 200 yards from the river. That's Dauphin County. So we really had always traditionally a lot of practice in real estate practice, and some estate practice, and some what I call middle class family practice. People come in about their wills. People come in because the daughter is in some terrible problem we have to try to figure out what to do about. People come in because they're fighting with a neighbor about something, and we try to discourage them from doing anything about it. And this is a middle class practice. We always had a lot of people come in from York County, and some from Dauphin, not so many from Dauphin. The river is wider than the creek. There's not as much interaction. But we always had some practice there. So typically, I rode circuit as a lawyer. In my busiest times, I would sometimes to do what I call a three-bagger. I would be in Harrisburg, Carlisle, and York in the same day. Once I did a four-bagger, Harrisburg, New Bloomfield for Perry County, York, and Carlisle, all in the same day. Other lawyers never looked at it that way, and I remember my dear friend Tom Beach, Bietsch, been gone now a few years. I had a matter with Tom once, and I said, "Now, Tom, we've got to finish up. I have to get down to York to file some papers." Tom says, "You're going to York? You're going to York County? Oh, good heavens." He would never do that. He had never been to York County to do anything. But I got to know people at all the courthouses. I knew the clerks and the women who waited on you and all that. And I got to be that kind of a lawyer. Interesting enough, our daughter, who has a family law practice with a lot of hearings, she has the same kind of a practice. She's in Harrisburg, she's in York, she's in New Bloomfield, and she's in Carlisle, in almost equal measure. So the automobile changed everything. When I started out, Jacob Reiff, R-E-I-F-F, was a lawyer who had then been practicing 60 years, and this is like 60 years ago. So Jake told me how when he started out, they would take the train to Carlisle once a week to file their papers. That was Carlisle Day. You took the train, because he started out before people had automobiles to drive there. So, of course, that's why we have so many county seats. Typically, the county seat is they're only as far apart as a horse can go in a day. That's why we have so many counties.
Just like the mills.
Exactly. Yeah, right. So.
Well, that leads me to thinking about how the roads have changed over the course of
yes.
your memory, and
yes.
how that's affected travel with
well,
83 and 81.
81 I avoid. There was a turnpike when the turnpike originally, only went from Irvine outside of Pittsburgh to Middlesex or something. And then it was extended to Philadelphia. That had happened before I started practice law. I always took the turnpike to Carlisle. And I took 83 to York, yes. So that hasn't changed that much. The roads have gotten busier. There's more traffic. It's more of a pain to drive, but that's the way it is. Now, of course, what has changed is electronic. Now, this is after I've basically gone what we call inactive. We are now filing so many things electronically. We no longer record deeds by driving to the courthouse, parking the car, walking into the recording office, chatting up the young woman, and handing her the papers and having her tell you that you're $2 short. We don't do that anymore. We file everything electronically, record. And we are almost to that point. In federal court, everything is electronic. In the county courts, the filings of matters in the pathonetary office, which is litigation, and that's not completely electronic yet, but we're moving fast on those issues. So there'll be a time when you can just, I guess, sit at home and talk on your smartphone and do everything, and you won't have to go anywhere anyway. So this is troubling to me because I got to know people in all these courthouses. I consider them interesting people and friends of mine. People don't go there anymore. You don't have to do that. So are we becoming are we all alone in the midst of all this noise? That's another question.
Poetic.
Yes. So, okay.
But altogether, you've been happy with your choice to go into the legal profession.
Yes, and I think I made the right decision for me in not getting mixed up with a large law firm. And I'm so much like my father and his father, and I do this, I think about the family tree. I have 3 children, 2 are lawyers, each has his own or her own law practice. I have an older son. We have an older son who has his own business, lighting consulting, totally different thing, but he is the king. So I've raised 2 kings and a queen, but I could never have put up with a large law firm and making 250 other lawyers happy. It would never have worked. I'm sorry, it just would not have worked. So I had to. What I did is what I had to do. My father, he couldn't stand to work for anybody. My grandfather, apparently, whom I never met, both grandfathers were self-employed, entrepreneurial kinds of people. They didn't work for people. So it's a gene. We just don't. We're not organization people. I'm sorry, we can't do it.
Well, now, is it because that you were an only son and you felt that is connected with your interest in history and knowing that your parents gave you the depository, or what do you attribute your interest in history?
My interest in history, that's very interesting. I don't know what that's all about. I think we're back to high school. We had the world history teacher, Mr. Fasick, F-A-S-I-C-K. Mr. Fasick, unfortunately, came to a tragic end because he committed suicide in his own backyard. But he was an interesting guy as a teacher because he had the timeline for world history. In that corner of the room, we had the Sumerians, and then we get to the Babylonians and those people. Then you move along, by the time you get to the first window, we're with the Egyptians. And over here in this corner come the Greeks. Then back here over the front door is the Romans. Then we get to the Dark Ages here in the corner, and then we get to the Middle Ages, and then and then you get the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and all that stuff's going on. And he had us thinking about how it all fits together. Now, I thought that was wonderful. And I talked to other people who had Mr. Fasick. They don't remember anything about this at all. I thought, this is 10th grade.
Yeah.
This is 10th grade. Well, you're 13 years old or something. And I thought it was great stuff. So it just sort of kind of picked up on it. So anyway, that's, yes, I think I have a natural inclination to that. So maybe I should have been a history teacher. I don't know.
So, but at some point you got interested enough in local history,
yes,
and that must have been through your parents, don't you think?
Well, yes, of course, my father was a great storyteller. Now, I wrote this memoir about how he grew up and all that. That was all from the dinner table. I heard all that over and over again, of course. You repeat them. And now we don't have dinner tables anymore. I'm just reading these figures, distressing figures. People don't have dinner together anymore. You've got to have dinner with your children. Yeah, we tried. And he has, I think I kind of course, he was a great reader. Now, he suffered from this very limited formal education, but he was always reading something. I think he might have been slightly dyslexic. He pondered over things. He struggled over the words, but he remembered it. Interesting about dyslexic people, they tend to have the focus and being able to remember things because they know they have to. It's such a struggle to get the word. Now, They didn't know about dyslexia in 1905. They didn't even know it when I was in school. But I kind of think he had that. Yeah. Yeah. So, where do I come from? I don't know. My mother, of course, I never went to a public school. She went to a private school in Harrisburg called Benson Sargent School for, I think it's really called this, for proper young ladies. Then she went to an Episcopal boarding school. What does a good Lutheran go to an Episcopal school? I don't know, but that's what happened. St. Mary's Hall in Burlington, New Jersey, a boarding school, which still exists as a day school with a different name. And so that was her experience. And so, of course, as I say, my parents were an unlikely match.
So I know from what I read that you became involved with the Masons because
Yes.
that was a family tradition.
Yes, yeah. Well, on both sides. My grandfather, Hanlon, was master of his lodge in Marietta, Pennsylvania in 1876, and I have his apron, which I need to give to the Masonic Museum in Boston. It takes time to give things away. Okay. Yes. And, of course, my father became a Mason in 1915. He was 22. He joined Robert Burns, one of the Blue Lodges in Harrisburg, and then shortly after that became what we call the consistory, a Scottish Rite Mason, and then a Shriner. Now, this was very important in those days, because when doing that, you got to meet everybody or find out who everybody was in town. This was a networking thing, a very serious networking thing. White Protestant males joined the Masons. And after a while, in a town like Harrisburg, they all knew each other, knew about each other. So my father had all these connections, all these people that he knew growing in his 20s and his 30s and his 40s. He got to know what was going on in town. Harrisburg now is totally changed. That has all disappeared. There's still Masons, but it's struggling. And nobody knows anybody anymore. And, of course, all the businesses in town that used to be run by the locals, and you would see them on Friday at Zembo Luncheon Club because they all had lunch together. Like 400 of them would have lunch together. This is the white Protestant establishment.
At
lunch
the
on Friday.
Shrine? Is
Yes,
that what
yeah. That's gone. There's still a luncheon club, but it's now 35 people show up. So that was very important. So he got to know who was who. And, of course, working in the bank, he got to hear all the gossip and all the news and got to know who was who. So of course, growing up, I heard all this at the dinner table. My parents talked endlessly about Harrisburg, who was who and who did what to whom and when, who had the money and who didn't have the money, what the scandals were. I heard all that. I don't know how to hear that today. I don't know who knows. Because all of our businesses now have disappeared or run by people who don't live here and don't know who we are and we don't know who they are. That's how the world has changed.
So when did you join Masons?
I was 21 years old because obviously I was greatly influenced by my father. You had to get in before you had an enemy so you wouldn't get blackballed. So best to join when you're 21, when nobody knows. Yeah, so yes. So I've stayed with that, and I'm still, I've never been an active Mason. In other words, I never went through the chairs, didn't do any of that, but I played a lot of piano. I've been the pianist for the Harrisburg Consistory Orchestra, that's the Scottish Rite Orchestra, for, I think, over a half century. And I've been the pianist for the Zembo Dance Band. We have a Glenn Miller kind of band. It's not very active now because we don't have a leader. But the string band is very active. We have 40 jobs this year, and I play with them. So, yes. And my piano lessons were about 2 years. I'm more self-taught than anything else, yes.
But apparently successfully so.
Yeah, I know.
Some of that trombonist
Yeah,
gene came through.
The music gene comes. My grandfather's stone apparently had an ear, Father said he could sit down and play a tune, play any tune. Pop had the ear. I have the ear. I have one grandson, David's son, Peter. He has the ear. So it's not completely lost. I didn't get the art gene. You see, my grandmother Stone's sister, Aunt Nora, in the memoir, she was a talented painter. I think largely self-taught. And I have a cousin, my father's brother's only child, my only first cousin. He had some artistic ability. As I said, I never got beyond stick figures. So we all have different gifts, as the preachers always remind us. Yes.
So what brought you to the Cumberland County Historical Society? Did a friend bring you in, or you just decided you were interested in it?
I don't remember exactly. I think it might have been Bob Christ, whom I knew pretty well many, many years ago. And, of course, Bob's wife was a good friend, and, of course, one of the Mars family. Of course, I consider one of the root families of the West Shore. And it might have been Bob Christ, and I'm not sure how else it happened, but somehow here I am. And I keep bringing you stuff.
Well,
from my boundless attic.
That's great too.
But some of the stuff is headed for the York County Heritage Society, because I have York connections. Dauphin County Historical Society, they've gotten a lot of things from me, and other directions, yes.
And have you been involved at all with the newer historical societies in the West Shore area?
Well, that's...
what is it, Gateway? Or
of course, there is a basic problem with these local historical societies. They don't have any money, and they have no proper place to put stuff. So they are all in peril. Apparently, recently there's been some kind of a fracas within the Gateway Historical Society between various members who are displeased with one another. I have avoided that completely. I think it's better if these people would focus their energies on the County Historical Society, because here at CCHS we have the proper facilities, we have the proper professional curators, we have people here who know what they're doing, and we have a little money. And none of that is true with any of these other societies. I belong to the Gateway so I can get the newsletter, but I've sort of stayed away from doing anything else about it. Now, my dear friend John Lefevre disagrees with me. He thinks New Cumberland things should stay in New Cumberland, otherwise nobody will ever see them. Yes, that's an argument, but where did we put them? We don't have a building, and we have no money to have a building. We have a library, but it's not a museum, it's a library. They are different functions. That's what I think about that.
Well, I think if you're satisfied with what we've talked about today, we close for today, and then have another session.
Absolutely.
We thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.